Just how accurate is the depiction of the Great War in Battlefield 1? Good afternoon, everyone. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Doodleman149, and I'm here today to look at all the Apocalypse maps for Battlefield 1 and give you the history behind each battle and what may be different between the in-game depictions and reality. In case you forgot, this was the fourth and final DLC pack we received, and it features the bloodiest battles of the Great War. This may be a lengthy one, so I've added chapters to the video if you're looking for your favorite map. So strap in, grab some popcorn as we look back on the history of the battles that inspired Battlefield 1. Caporetto. The first map we'll look at is Caporetto. This battle, also known as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, took place between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, reinforced with German troops, and the Kingdom of Italy. The battle took place between October 24th and November 19th of 1917. The Austro-Hungarian 14th Army, combined with the Germans' 5th Army, brought the Central Powers' strength to 353,000 soldiers and 2,518 artillery pieces. The Italian 2nd Army could only field 257,000 soldiers and 1,342 artillery pieces. Right off the bat, the Italians were outnumbered and outgunned and would be fighting a literal uphill battle. Prior to this catastrophic battle, throughout the spring and summer of 1917, the Italians had launched numerous offensives on the Austro-Hungarians near the Isonzo River. The 11th Battle of the Isonzo had ended in an Italian victory and left both sides exhausted in terms of troops and supplies. In an effort to take advantage of this weakness on both sides, Emperor Karl of the Austro-Hungarian Empire wrote to Kaiser Wilhelm II asking for German forces to be deployed in Italy. In August, a German and an Austro-Hungarian commander shifted troops from the Eastern Front with Russia to assist along with German chemist Otto Hahn. Otto was an expert on poison gas attacks and was there to find the best possible site for a gas attack against the Italians. Lastly, the Germans sent Lieutenant General Konrad Kraft von Dellmann-Singen, an expert in mountain warfare, to scout the grounds. Due to bad weather conditions, as well as a lack of readiness of the Austro-Hungarians, the attack on Caporetto was delayed for 2 days. Then, on October 24th, with no wind in the area and the front covered in mountain mist, at 2 in the morning, 894 tubes of Gaswurfminen, or German Lebensprojectors, launched canisters of chlorine arsenic agent and diaphosphine gas onto the Italian forces. Since gas masks could only protect against this type of attack for 2 hours, and with there being no wind to dissipate the gas attack, the Italians retreated. Even so, around 600 soldiers were killed. To allow for the gas to dissipate and to further soften the defenders, the front was quiet until 6 o'clock in the morning when all the Italian wire defenses and trenches were shelled by mortars. At 6:41, 2,200 artillery pieces opened fire on the valley road on which the Italian reserves were funneled to the front lines. At 8 o'clock, the infantry of the Central Powers advanced into the valley and broke through the almost undefended fortifications and breached the Italian defensive line. In order to preserve this central advance, Alpine troops were deployed on the flanks of the central push in order to occupy Italian defenders and harass them with artillery. This would prevent the central column from being encircled and stopped. Specially equipped stormtroopers led the attack utilizing the new Maxim 0815 light machine gun, mortars, flamethrowers, and hand grenades. The attackers in the valley advanced almost unopposed towards Italy, some even making it 16 miles in a single day. The Italians were able to repel the Alpine troops for the most part, but the advance of the central column forced the Italians to pull troops on the flanks in an attempt to stop the central advance. This, however, only weakened the flanks, allowing the Alpine troops to advance as well. The entire Italian front was in jeopardy of failing. The commander of the 2nd Italian Army, Luigi Capello, could tell what was happening with his troops and advocated for a retreat to the Tagliamento River to regroup. Capello's superior, Luigi Cardona, believed his soldiers could regroup and end the advance. He was incorrect. 6 days after the initial assault, Cardona relented and allowed forces to retreat to the other side of the river. However, this retreat would take a full 4 days, during which the Central Powers would ambush defenders. On November 2nd, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians were able to establish a bridgehead across the Tagliamento River. However, the success of this attack would come to bite the Central Powers. With such a quick advance, central supply lines could not properly keep up with the advancing troops, and so the attack slowed tremendously. Had the supply lines been more robust and capable of keeping up with the advance, the Austro-Hungarians would have been able to launch another attack that would isolate part of the Italian army against the Adriatic Sea. Luckily for the Italians, this stall allowed for Cardona to further retreat and establish defensive positions on the Piave River and Monte Grappa. Monte Grappa would be where this Austro-Hungarian assault would lose all of its momentum, something I covered in a previous history video. See the link in the top right and in the description. In the aftermath, Cardona would be forced to resign in disgrace. He was known for having extremely poor relations with other commanders and being extremely harsh on his troops. This harshness is what led to roughly 275,000 Italian troops surrendering. Most of these soldiers were reported to have surrendered willingly. Luckily for Italy, Armando Diaz would be brought in to replace Cardona, again a man referenced in the same video I mentioned earlier. In terms of actual fighting, 13,000 Italians were killed, 30,000 were wounded, thousands of weapons were seized, and roughly 600,000 people were displaced in the invaded lands. On the other end, 70,000 casualties were reported between the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, with no exact number of deaths reported. In the end, the Battle of Caporetto saw the Austro-Hungarians advance 93 miles to the Piave River. Looking at the battle we actually partake in, the Austro-Hungarians begin the attack on the high ground with a Livens projector available to launch gas at the first objective ahead of them, a series of battered and shelled Italian trenches. Beyond that lies a road and a destroyed town before heading further down into the valley to Italian positions near the Tagliamento River. There are a number of nice references to the actual battle, the first of them being the Livens projectors throughout the map. While these were only used in the initial attack and not throughout the battle, and while they were far deadlier in real life, their inclusion is a nice historical bit of accuracy. On top of that, the push down the mountain to the Italians' last line of defenses at the river is a good testament to the actual course of battle over 100 years ago. While the casualties aren't nearly as high in-game as they were in reality, this battle remains mostly faithful to the real-life events. Passchendaele. The next map we'll look at is Passchendaele, another map that I've been mispronouncing myself for a long time. I used to call it Passchendaele. You learn something new every day. The Battle of Passchendaele was also known as the Third Battle of Ypres and took place between July and November of 1917. It saw the British, French, and Belgian armies go up against the German army on a series of ridges to the southeast of the Belgian city of Ypres in West Flanders. Passchendaele sits on the final ridge east of Ypres, which was only 5 miles from the rail station at Roulers. Roulers was the main supply route of the German Fourth Army, so taking that station would help stifle the German army's ability to function. Over the months-long battle, the British would deploy 50 divisions along with 6 French divisions against the 77 to 83 divisions of the German Fourth Army. This campaign in Flanders region of Belgium has remained controversial to this day, due in large part to its perceived strategic and tactical oversights, as well as the sheer number of human lives lost for the little gain, as was the norm for many human wave battles of World War I. The plan was to pinch the German forces in Belgium between the British expeditionary forces and the French forces, which were to break through the German lines to the south. This French operation, headed by the infamous Robert Nivelle, ultimately failed, and the British chose to push into Belgium on a single front. Preparations by the British for this operation started in 1915 and included doubling the rail lines of the Hasbrouck-Ypres Railroad, as well as construction of another railroad to maintain a constant and steady stream of supplies and troops to the front. Next, in February of 1917, Colonel Norman Macmillan proposed that the Gevolt Plateau north of the main battlefield be seized by a mass tank attack in order to provide a suitable artillery position for the battle. Unfortunately, in April, Captain Giffard Lequesne Martel found that the area was unsuitable for tanks, so it was not taken. On the German side of things, following the Battle of Messines Ridge, they had predicted the British would attempt to capitalize on their success and push north towards Ypres proper. To fortify their 25-mile front, the German Fourth Army was to construct defenses at and reinforce 6 key positions along the front. Between these key defensive positions were villages such as Zonbeck and Passchendaele, which were also bolstered to hold off the British. Seeing as the Battle of Passchendaele lasted for over 3 months, I'll need to break down the following sections, so stay with me if you can. If not, I have, of course, added chapters to the video to help find where you are. The first Battle of Passchendaele occurred on October 12, 1917, several months after the Third Battle of Ypres began. After a dry spell in September, rains began on October 3rd, and by the Battle of Poel-Capelle on October 9th, much of the British field artillery opposite Passchendaele was out of action due to rain, mud, and German artillery fire. The remaining guns were either left in their old positions and fired at the limit of their range, or were operated from any flat ground near wooden roadways or from platforms, many of which were unstable, where it was found impossible to move them forward. General Herbert Plumer and Field Marshal Douglas Haig were left under the impression that a big advance had been made towards Passchendaele Ridge, but most of the ground that had been taken had been lost to German counterattacks in the afternoon. As such, the British attack on October 12th began 2,500 yards from the village instead of the 1,500 yards they were supposed to have started from. Air recon revealed the true position too late to make substantial changes to the plan. The main attack of the Second Army was by the 2 Anzac Corps supported by the Fifth Army to the north. On Passchendaele Ridge, opposite the 1st and 2nd Anzac Corps, the attack was repulsed, or captured ground was recovered by German counterattacks. The attack on the right flank of the Fifth Army was a costly failure, but on the left, the fringe of Hout-Hilst Forest was gained. British attacks were postponed until the weather improved and the communications behind the front were restored. The battle was a decisive German defensive success, but was just as costly for the Germans. So much so that 2 divisions were diverted from other fronts to Flanders in order to replace the extraordinarily high losses. British casualties in October of 1917 were the 3rd highest in the war, after July 1916 and April 1917. Out of the 5 British, 3 Australian, and 1 New Zealand division, the Allies suffered 13,000 casualties while the Germans took 12,000. The Second Battle of Passchendaele occurred between October 26th, my wife's birthday, and November 10th of 1917. Here the Canadian Corps relieved the now exhausted 2nd Anzac Corps in the center of the push. The second battle was to take place in phases with a few days in between attacks in order to properly relieve frontline troops and to consolidate gains. In all, this battle saw 4 Canadian, 6 British, 1 Australian, 2 French, and 1 Belgian division go against the 6 defending German divisions. The Allied attack captured the German-held high ground along the Passchendaele-Westerbeek Ridge, but the campaign ended just short of Westerbeek. The victory of the Austro-German forces against the Italian army at the Battle of Caporetto and the forthcoming Battle of Cambrai forced the British to divert resources from Ypres. 5 British divisions were transferred to Italy, and 4 British divisions on the coast were sent to take over French positions south of the Somme. Despite the overwhelming forces they faced, the German defenders managed to inflict heavy casualties to the Allied forces, which accumulated over 30,000 casualties. The Germans, however, suffered worse, taking 45,000 casualties. In all, the Flanders campaign was very controversial for both Allied and German people, mostly because of the callous loss of life on both sides and the commitment to this battle, a stubbornness on both sides that contributed to the massive loss of human life. In all, the Third Battle of Ypres caused between 240 and 448,000 Allied casualties, and between 217 and 400,000 German casualties. This range is so great because there are competing records of just how many people were lost in this battle, most likely caused by poor record keeping, poor communication, and poor weather making massive amounts of bodies to be lost in the mud and muck, a truly tragic campaign experienced during the Great War. Looking at the battle we partake in, it appears to be the Second Battle of Passchendaele, considering one of the objectives on the map is the Bellevue Line, a series of pillboxes that were seized by the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade after heavy artillery cleared the barbed wire from their path. Based on that alone, and some pictures I've seen of the conditions of this front, I'd say the battle we partake in is mostly accurate. Massive artillery craters dot the landscape of the now completely destroyed village of Passchendaele. All of the ground is mud after the serious downpours and terrible weather conditions that plagued this theater of war. Abandoned artillery pieces can be seen strewn about, as the mud also made these weapons incapable of being moved or properly targeted because of the soft ground they sat on. The bombed-out husks of houses and a church are the only remaining features of the town that once stood here. Trench lines can be taken by the British assault that once belonged to the exhausted German forces, and due to the wide nature of this map, German counterattacks are very possible and can easily be successful, just as they were in real life. Thinking about the hundreds of thousands of lives thrown away in this battle really makes the title of the DLC it's coupled with hit even harder. The River Somme. The final map we'll be looking at is the River Somme. Specifically, we'll be looking at the first day on the Somme, as this is when the battle we partake in occurs. This battle remains the bloodiest day in British military history. Over the course of a single day, the British forces near the Somme River took 57,470 casualties. 19,240 of those were confirmed KIAs. In comparison, the German defenders took only around 12,000 casualties with an unknown number of confirmed deaths. A truly staggering military defeat for the British and a largely one-sided affair, all things considered. While I spoiled the ending, let's take a look at the battle itself to see where things went wrong for the British troops. On this first day, the area around the Somme River would see 13 British divisions under the command of Douglas Haig, the architect behind the operation to take Passchendaele in Flanders, and Henry Rawlinson, along with 6 French divisions commanded by Ferdinand Foch and Émile Fourier, going against 6 German divisions under the command of Fritz von Below. That basically has the Germans outnumbered 3-1 on the defense, but they took far less casualties than they inflicted. In preparation for this battle, the 9th Wing of the Royal Flying Corps was moved to the Somme front. In all, the RFC brought 185 aircraft against the German Air Force. These craft were to counter German artillery, defeat German aircraft, and provide trench reconnaissance for the infantry advance. Special bombing runs were made along the railways behind the German front in order to limit reinforcements of men and material to the front. Supply dumps and ammunition depots were also targeted behind the lines for the same reason. In terms of artillery, the British had substantially increased the amount of artillery on the Western Front after the Battle of Loos in late 1915. But the length of the front to be bombarded on the Somme led to the preparatory bombardment being planned to last for 5 whole days. On the first day on the Somme, 250,000 British shells were fired at German positions. The barrage was so long and massive that it could be heard 165 miles away from the front. Unfortunately, most of the shells fired were shrapnel shells, which were less effective against German trenches without precise bombardment. On the other side of the field, the Germans had much more high-explosive ammunition for their heavy guns and howitzers, while also having more experienced personnel. Looking at British cavalry, the British disbanded 2 cavalry corps in order to distribute their men and horses into a reserve army, which was to exploit any holes in German defenses made by the French Fourth Army. Should the German army collapse, they were to capture the town of Bapaume and hold the right flank of the British army. If there was to be no breakthrough, they were to return to positions west of Amiens to be held in reserve for the next available use. For the infantry portion of the battle, a sort of leapfrog tactic was to be deployed. One wave of troops was to advance on the German positions, which was to be followed up by another wave 100 yards behind them. Once the front line engaged the German positions, they were to be reinforced by the follow-up wave. This follow-up wave would assist in the first in taking the position before advancing on to the next. The initial advanced troops would then be tasked with clearing the taken positions and reinforcing them. Mines were also dug towards the German positions. These mines would be collapsed 2 minutes before the first wave was to advance in order to safely create craters for the advancing troops to take cover in, and to approach the German trenches in relative safety. On the German side, many of the troops on the first day of the Somme had been there since 1914, making great advances in fortifying their defensive lines and reinforcing their positions with supply lines and railways. They had also made massive dugouts every 50 yards that were underground and large enough to house 25 men each. German artillery was organized into barrage sectors, and each infantry officer was expected to know the artillery batteries covering their section of the front line. These officers were linked to the battery crews by a telephone system, with lines buried 6 feet deep all the way back to the artillery positions 5 miles back. A third defensive line was constructed and near completion by the time the battle started. In the air, the Germans fielded 42 recon planes, 17 artillery spotting planes, 51 planes in bomber fighter squadrons, and 19 single-seater fighter planes. In total, they brought 129 aircraft to the battle. While comparative in quantity, the Germans still held the numerical advantage over the British in the air. For the focus of this discussion, we'll ignore the French portions on the first day of the battle and instead focus on the British 3rd and 4th Armies. For the 3rd Army, they were to mount a diversion north of the 4th Army's battlefield. They were to attack the Gaumecourt salient in a pincer maneuver that was to be made as obvious as possible in order to draw in German reinforcements from where the 4th Army would attack. Advanced trenches had been dug in order to offer a jumping-off point for British soldiers, and when they attacked at 7:30 in the morning, they fairly quickly took the first 3 German trenches. They then quickly pushed forward in order to meet up with the other divisions in the area. However, a German artillery barrage swept over no man's land, which pinned down the exposed troops and prevented any reinforcements from coming to the captured trenches. After dark, they were forced to withdraw. The following day, the ground was particularly wet and muddy, and many British troops did not even reach the German trenches. Those that did quickly overran the front line. However, in their haste, they missed many hidden German troops who emerged from their dugout shelters to attack the British from behind. The German barrage of no man's land prevented British reinforcements from routing the bunkered Germans. Multiple German counterattacks were made, which, despite some failures, eventually retook the trenches lost to the British. The British 46th Division suffered 2,445 casualties, which was the lowest divisional losses of the day. The British 56th Division took 4,314 casualties, and their commander, Major General Montague Stuart Wortley, was dismissed for the failure. On the German side, a total of 1,212 casualties were incurred, a decisive victory for the Germans against the British Third Army. Now let's talk about the British Fourth Army that did more than just be a distraction for their allies. There are 10 engagements that we'll talk about with the Fourth Army. First, there was the capture of Malbotten. On the southern flank of the British lines, the 30th Division took its objectives on the trench by 1 p.m., and the 18th Division completed theirs by 3 p.m. This attack went very well for the British, seeing as the troops advanced under the cover of a creeping barrage, and most of the German artillery and machine guns were destroyed by a preliminary artillery bombardment. These trenches that Germans had were less complete than the ones to the north, with none having deep dugouts except for the first trench line. Despite the success, the 30th Division suffered 3,011 casualties, the 18th Division took 3,115 casualties, and the German defenders involved took a total of 3,957 casualties. Next, we have the 15th Corps' capture of Mametz. Mametz was a village on a hill that was to be attacked by the 7th Division, which only had to cross 100 to 200 yards of no man's land, a stretch I still would never want to cross. These troops were again assisted by a creeping barrage of artillery, which reduced the casualties amongst the advancing infantry considerably. However, once British troops reached the village itself, they were met with strong resistance from the Germans. The east end of the village was swiftly captured, but further attacks into the village were repulsed until artillery hammered the village and British troops disrupted the supply lines of the defenders. The village was then taken and occupied. The 7th Division took a whopping 3,380 casualties in this battle, while a single German regiment took 2,148 casualties. Our next engagement is the capture of Fricourt, where the 7th Division from the Battle of Mametz was to swing left from the village to create a defensive line. The British 21st Division was to advance past the village and swing around the rear of Fricourt to catch the Germans in a pincer maneuver. In order to limit the enemy's fire they'd take from the village, mines were detonated near the village to create a lip of earth that would shield the British from the view of the defenders. The 10th West Yorkshire Regiment was ordered to advance close to the village but took 733 casualties, which were the worst battalion losses of the day. A company of the 7th Green Howards made an unplanned attack directly against the village and was promptly annihilated. The German Reserve Infantry Regiment 111 suffered greatly under the British artillery, with many dugouts being blocked by explosions, and one company was reduced to just 80 men before the British attacked. Reinforcements and counterattacks were unable to reach the trenches due to the continued British bombardment. Due to the loss of Mametz and the advance of the British, the Germans retreated from Fricourt in the night and the British occupied it virtually unopposed. The British 21st Division suffered 4,256 casualties, the 50th Brigade of the 17th Division suffered 1,155 casualties, and the German losses amounted to 2,104, including 1,625 prisoners. The British 3rd Corps 34th Division would engage in the capture of La Boisselle. Here, British sappers had set explosives in 2 mines on either side of the village of La Boisselle. The explosion of the Y sap mine to the north of the village caused no casualties, as German defenders had intercepted British telephone communications and were able to evacuate the area. However, the second mine, the Lochner mine, would be detonated and would temporarily trap some German soldiers in nearby shelters. Some men from the Grimsby Chums made it to the crater to engage the Germans, but were immediately pinned down by German small arms fire and friendly British artillery. They remained there for the rest of the day. A Scottish brigade was to advance in the southern edge of the village, while an Irish brigade was held in reserve to relieve the Scots should they capture the village. After crossing the mile-wide open area leading to no man's land, some 50 Scots survived to reach the village but were immediately captured, thus ending the furthest British advance of the day. The British suffered 9,860 casualties in this engagement, while the Germans only suffered around 1,600. The next area to look at was the capture of Olivers, where the British 8th Division went against the German Infantry Regiment 180. The British had to cross 750 yards of no man's land to reach the German trenches. This stretch was covered by the guns from La Boisselle to the south, Olivers in the center, and Thiepval Spur to the north. It was a meat grinder. Despite this, when all 3 brigades of the 8th Division attacked, 200 men reached the 2nd German trenches and held them until 9 in the morning. The center brigade reached the second line but were forced back to the British front line, while the left-hand brigade reached the 3rd German trench line. This group was then cut off from reinforcements by German artillery. There was a lack of coordination between the infantry and artillery for this battle, so field artillery was being moved during the push, and the heavy artillery had started to move an hour before the attack, so there was no support fire to strike at the Germans while they repulsed the attacks. British infantry destroyed many German defenses, but they were met by mass small arms fire at 100 yards from the trenches, which cut down many of the attackers. All British attacks were contained in the end, and the Germans suffered 280 casualties, while the British amassed a massive 5,121 casualties. Now we move on to the Leipzig salient and Thiepval, where both were attacked by the British 10th Corps 32nd Division. Just before 7:30 in the morning, the Glasgow commercials stealthily advanced through no man's land until they were just 30 yards from the German lines. At 7:30, when the rest of the first day of the battle began, the British rushed the trench and swiftly captured it from the unprepared Germans, and the Leipzig redoubt was captured. There were attempts to push further and take advantage of the quick success, but German machine gun fire made this a non-option. The British attempted to take the village of Thiepval, but since the machine gun post there had survived the British artillery bombardment, they opened fire on any approaching British. The garrison at Thiepval emerged from the shelters and cellars of the village as the British approached and cut them down with small arms fire, leaving a, quote, wall of dead in front of their position. In the end, the British suffered over 4,500 casualties, while the Germans suffered about 300, with the 3rd Company of Infantry Regiment 180 being completely annihilated. The 36th Ulster Division attacked between Thiepval and the river in an area called the Schwaben Redoubt. This area received a fair amount of combined British and French artillery, which destroyed most of the defenses and allowed for the 36th to advance quickly against the overwhelmed defenders. However, in their haste and with the failures to advance on either of their flanks, the 36th found themselves taking German fire from three sides. Add to this that the Germans began bombarding no man's land behind them and they were effectively surrounded. German counterattacks were disorganized and floundered until 10 p.m. when two fresh battalions were able to muster and retake the redoubt. The 36th Division suffered around 5,000 casualties while the Germans took about half that number. The final group of battles will be from the 8th Corps of the British Fourth Army. The 29th Division was to attack Beaumont Hamel, and this attack was to be preceded by the detonation of a 40,000-pound mine beneath the Hawthorne Ridge redoubt at 7:20 a.m. This mine detonation alerted the Germans of the impending attack that would come 10 minutes later. Due to this and a lack of British coordination, German troops were able to take up positions on their side of the crater before British troops could occupy it, leading to many of them being shot down on approach. In another lack of coordination, German white signal rockets were spotted and interpreted by Major General Beauvoir de Lille as British success flares and subsequently ordered the 88th Brigade to advance to exploit this success. These troops had to advance over open ground 200 yards back from the British front line. Even this far back, many were hit by German fire as they were held up by uncut barbed wire. The Newfoundland Regiment from the 88th Reserve Brigade took 710 casualties, a 91% loss, during this folly of a push. In total, the 29th Division suffered 5,240 casualties, while the German Infantry Regiment 119 took 292 casualties, 101 of which were killed. Lastly, the 4th and 31st Divisions were to take the position between Serre and Beaumont Hamel, an area called the Quadrilateral. They did so at the start of the attack but were unable to advance further. Because of the British failure at Beaumont Hamel, the 4th Division was held up by German attacks from that direction. Despite this, the Quadrilateral was reinforced by a number of British, Scottish, and Irish regiments. However, over the course of the day, German counterattacks pushed all British troops back except for the Irish, who had not received the order to retreat until the next day. The 4th Division took 5,752 casualties this day. For the 31st Division, they didn't fare much better. They had to attack uphill and were faced with more than 70,000 German small arms rounds being fired at them. While small groups of the division did cross no man's land and reach their objective, they were quickly cut off and killed or captured. The 31st Division would see 3,600 casualties this day. On the German side, the explosion of the Hawthorne Ridge redoubt had blown up several infantry sections, and the rest of the surviving garrison were trapped underground until after the attack. Reserve Infantry Regiment 119 took 292 casualties, Regiment 121 took 560 casualties, and Regiment 169 took 362 casualties, totaling a meager 1,214 casualties. These battles were a decisive German victory. In addition to the tactical failures in the field, there were also logistical and communication failures on the part of the British. General Haig wrote in his diary that he'd heard reports that most of the 8th Corps had not left their trenches when ordered, despite the fact that they did leave their trenches and suffered 14,000 casualties doing so. 18 ambulance trains had been requested in anticipation for the high casualties of the operation, but only 3 were provided, many of which only partially filled when they left the field. The field hospital only had the capacity for 9,500 casualties, a comically small number given how many were taken by the British. Because of this, many of the wounded were left in the field to suffer and die. It took 3 days for all the casualties on the first day to be treated, and some were even sent back to England for treatment while still wearing their field dressings. Some men were left in no man's land for over a week, being able to scavenge supplies from the dead and dying. In the end, British casualties totaled 57,470, 19,240 of which were killed, while the Germans took anywhere from 10 to 12,000. Truly one of the most horrific days in human history. Looking at the battle we partake in, it was difficult to pin down exactly where we were fighting, given there are so many battles to look at on this first day. There are some inaccuracies, however. For one, the usage of land ships by the British were first seen in September of 1916 in the Somme. This is a month after the first day on the Somme, which is when the battle in-game is listed as taking place. The pristine nature of the countryside in-game also lends itself to being the first day of this long battle. This clean look can also give us a clue as to where the battle takes place as far as I've read. No trench lines were left virtually untouched. So, we can try to go off the Hawthorne Station at the rear of the map. While the Hawthorne Ridge was destroyed by a massive explosion, there is no such indicator on this map, meaning that it can't have taken place there. The greatest destruction is at the rear of the map, with many broken German heavy guns sitting there useless. This leads me to believe that this battle we partake in is the capture of Montbatten, since it's noted that much of the German artillery in the area had been destroyed in the week-long British and French bombardment that preceded it. Despite relatively narrowing it down, I can't seem to find anything about the battle that correlates with any of the objectives or landmarks shown on the map. So for the most part, I believe this battle's topography is mostly fabricated. And so there you go, everyone, an extremely lengthy look at some of the most devastating battles of the entire First World War. Caporetto saw the resounding defeat and retreat of the Italian army after the hubris of Cardona got the better of him. Passchendaele saw similar hubris on the side of the British as they pushed into Belgium and threw waves of men into the meat grinder. And the Somme saw the bloodiest day in British military history. The truest horrors of the war were on full display here, and it's sobering to read and learn about an entire generation that was thrown into the fire. I was contemplating looking at the air assault maps, but given we don't see much of them to compare, I didn't see a need to do so. And so I'd like to thank everyone who stuck around to the end of the video. Most of the maps seem fairly accurate with the exception of the Somme, so it was nice to see some research was done and attention to detail was maintained for the final DLC of Battlefield 1. What did you think of the Apocalypse DLC? Was the lack of maps acceptable for the inclusion of so many new weapons in a new game mode? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you liked the video and want to see more from yours truly, then subscribe to never miss an upload. That's all the map history I've got for Battlefield 1, so this will end this mini-series. I've gotten a suggestion to do the same format for Battlefield 5, so we'll have to see how that pans out. Keep an eye out in case that crops up. I'll put out a community post and a tweet if I decide to go through with it. I've also got 4 historical weapon shorts dropping on Tuesday, so be sure to check those out as well. I've been DriZzlingBeAr149, and until next time, I will see you later.